everybody, and welcome to this episode of Foundry Fireside. My name is Zipporah, and I am an intern working with the Foundry communications team. Today, I will be talking to Elyssa Hofgard, a PhD student at MIT, working at the Foundry as part of her DOE Computational Science Graduate Fellowship. So she will be telling us more about her research at the Foundry, as well as her PhD research at MIT. So let's get started by having you introduce yourself and telling us about your research at the Foundry.
Sounds good. Hi everyone. My name's Elyssa Hofgard. Just finished my second year in a PhD program in electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. I did my undergrad in physics at Stanford, and I also have a master's in computational math from Stanford. So this summer, I'm an intern at the Foundry working with Sinead Griffin, who's a scientist at the Foundry, and Dmitry Morozov, who's in the computational science division. And this summer, I'm working on studying the structure of amorphous topological materials. And I'm going to explain what those are. But the basic question I'm trying to answer is, how does the structure of these materials map to their properties? So one thing we know about stolen materials is that they're characterized by repeating patterns, and this forms a lot of the basis of our theory of these materials. However, amorphous materials do not have this long-range periodicity, so they don't have these repeating patterns. But many of the materials in our world are amorphous. And an example of these are glasses, a lot of plastics are amorphous, and these materials can provide unique mechanical, electrical, and optical properties. So what I'd like to explore is if, even though there's not this long range order, if there are certain parts of the material or different length scales of structure that may be present and how these map to the material's properties. And so kind of another layer of complexity in this is whether a material's topological or not. And so briefly, kind of what topology is trying to characterize the nature of shapes independent of their deformation. So the classic example is that you can deform a donut into a coffee mug. These are like topologically equivalent shapes because a donut has a hole in it, and then so does a coffee mug. And so topological materials basically have states that are protected against these deformations. So they're protected against these impurities or defects. So an example is that, for example, it could be a topological insulator where these materials act as insulators in the bulk of them, but have conductive state on their surface or edges. And these surface states are robust against perturbations like impurities or defects. So you can imagine that these would be very useful materials. And so topological amorphous materials represent new phases of matter where this topological nature and disorder can coexist. And so this is kind of an emerging frontier in condensed matter that I'm interested in looking at. And then I'm using some data analysis techniques with my mentor in computing to see if we can find parts of these materials that are structured and how this maps to the material properties.
That's great. Thank you so much. Could you tell me a little bit about the current condensed matter problems that we encounter in the world?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess for me, computational condensed matter and material science is currently a really exciting field to be in. Some examples of current problems that the field is trying to address. You may have heard about this about a year ago, or maybe a bit longer. There was a lot of buzz around discovering a high temperature superconductor. And so these are materials that can conduct electricity without resistance below a certain critical temperature. But most superconductors, this critical temperature is very low. So most of them currently require expensive cooling systems. So it'd be great to be able to discover a high temperature one, which could then be used for electrical power transmission and advanced computing, for example, without a lot of the energy costs that would now be incurred by using a current superconductor. Another frontier is quantum computing. trying to develop stable quantum computers that could simulate problems in material science, as well as solve problems in cryptography, as well as kind of trying to improve energy storage and solar cells. So in general, the main theme throughout these problems is given a set of material properties that we want, whether something's a good solar cell or something like that, we want to be able to generate a material to guide experimentalists that matches these properties. And so that's kind of the overarching theme that I'm interested in looking at, and where kind of machine learning or these sort of like generative models of materials may be useful.
That's great. So you did just sort of touch on this, but do you have anything else to say about why this research is important?
Yeah, so a lot of these advanced materials, they're present in our everyday lives. They've provided real world impacts. For example, with electronics and semiconductors, these currently are the backbone of like our computers and smartphones and stuff like that. Um, Superconductors have currently been used in MRI machines. They're kind of powered by these superconducting magnets. So I think a better theoretical understanding of amorphous materials and kind of new phases of matter will allow us to kind of further these technological impacts that we've already seen from advanced materials.
That's super cool. What is an example of maybe an environmental problem that this research could help solve?
Yeah, so I guess the hope for me is that some of these materials will be relevant for environmental challenges like energy efficiency. So, for example, I talked about these robust surface states that are present in topological materials. So, potentially, these could be used for improved electrical conductivity, possibly used for developing more efficient electronic devices and circuits, and thus reducing energy loss in these electrical systems. Another example could maybe be using these to enhance the efficiency of solar cells, as well as creating new thermoelectric devices that convert waste heat into electricity. So kind of just improving energy efficiency throughout these processes. So this would, I guess, be the ideal. Not currently sure if these materials will help with these challenges, but the hope is that they will.
Yeah, that's great. What makes you most excited about this research or this topic?
Yeah, so I think this is, from my understanding, a relatively new field. So there's a lot of potential for collaboration with experimental, computational, which is more what I do, and then as well as theoretical work in condensed matter. So I really like that it's very interdisciplinary and you get a lot of opportunities to work with people who are knowledgeable in different fields, as well as I think there's a really large potential for impact, for example, with superconductivity, as well as improving our computational or energy storage abilities. So it's kind of an exciting time to be in the field, as well as a lot more data being generated about different materials, which again leads to more potential to use like machine learning or other tools to mine the data.
Hmm. So how do you see machine learning further impacting your field in the future?
Yeah, so basically how I like to think of machine learning is basically trying to find patterns from data. And so in the last like 20 years or so, we've had kind of a data revolution where our computational abilities have improved a lot. So we've been able to generate a lot more simulated data of materials, for example, as well as in other fields. So as this data revolution continues and as experimental techniques also keep improving, we'll be able to develop better and more useful machine learning models, to essentially find patterns in these data. For example, how different material structures influence their properties. And so kind of an example that's, I guess, more relevant to like protein structure prediction is AlphaFold. So this is a model developed by DeepMind that's designed to predict the three-dimensional structure of proteins from their amino acid sequences. And this has been kind of a long-standing challenge in biology. So AlphaFold kind of represented a pretty big breakthrough using machine learning to address this challenge. Although it's not perfect, obviously, but the hope is that through collaborating with domain experts, then machine learning can be kind of a useful tool that they can add to their toolbox. So kind of another example is experimentally characterizing materials can be pretty time consuming because there's such a vast design space of potential materials. So as we generate more data, it'd be great to be able to kind of narrow this design space and then give experimentalists kind of a more narrow list of materials that might have interesting properties that they can then characterize. So I kind of look at it as a tool to guide our exploration of advanced materials. It's not like machine learning will magically solve our problems, but I think with domain knowledge and collaboration with experimentalists, it can be a pretty powerful tool.
Yeah, great. What is your favorite part about being a Foundry user, and why did you want to come work at the Foundry?
Yeah, so I've really enjoyed working at the Foundry so far. I think my favorite part is being able to collaborate and work with so many knowledgeable scientists, like Sinead, as well as the postdocs and other PhD students in my group. And everyone here has just been very friendly and welcoming as well. So that's kind of a plus. And I personally wanted to come here because in my PhD, I've been doing kind of more machine learning research, but I wanted to see how this translates to material science and condensed matter research, as well as just being able to be more exposed to this field and see if it's something I want to pursue further in the future.
I think it's great that you had the opportunity to come here and
Yeah, it's been great.
yeah. Okay, so moving on to your PhD research, could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there at MIT?
Yeah, for sure. So at MIT, I'm working with Tess Smith in electrical engineering and computer science. And it's pretty interdisciplinary department as well. There are a lot of people from like applied physics, math. So that's been, I guess, kind of cool as well to have that sort of atmosphere in my PhD. And I'm working on developing symmetry preserving machine learning algorithms for scientific applications. So just to kind of explain what this means. So a lot of times in scientific problems and in physics especially, we have a certain set of symmetries that our system obeys. So for example, if you have a molecule in 3D space and you rotate the molecule, the properties of the molecule will remain the same no matter which way it's rotated. So our machine learning algorithms essentially bake this into the architecture itself. So a traditional machine learning algorithm might not know that a rotated copy of a molecule is the same, but ours preserve this symmetry. So this removes a lot of need for data augmentation or other techniques to make the machine learning algorithm know that it's the same copy of the molecule. So right now I'm working on building models to aid the experimental characterization of materials, as well as models looking into kind of learning sources of symmetry breaking and developing ones that may deal better with like more complex data sets where we might not have full symmetry, but we want to preserve some sort of symmetry. So this could be an example of more like dynamical systems or like fluid dynamics where you have kind of more complex data than just a molecule in 3D space.
Why is this, you said more complex data, why is this important, and how can that be applied in our lives?
Yeah, so equivariant machine learning, that's like formally what the symmetry preserving machine learning is called, has already been applied for scientific discovery. So for example, it's been looked at in drug discovery, where these models might perform better for kind of predicting new drug candidates, protein folding like AlphaFold, as well as materials design, and then kind of extending to more complex data sets, maybe used for like robotics or control systems, as well as I'm personally interested looking into like climate models and how symmetry preserving machine learning can be used there. So that's a pretty complicated scenario because you have a lot of like forces and fluids going around in the climate, but hopefully enforcing some sort of symmetry preservation may still be useful.
Okay,
Yeah.
last question. What new research or questions are you most excited about?
Yeah, so I guess I have kind of three things I'm most excited about. So the first thing is kind of how do we develop robust models that generalize to experimental data? So kind of the issue that we've seen with a lot of these machine learning models for materials is that they're trained on like computational data. So data that's like generated using techniques like density functional theory and other like computational material science workflows. But this data sometimes is a bit less noisy or a bit different from experimental data. And so your model is basically only as good as the data that it's trained on. So if you train it on data that doesn't really match experiments, then it won't be able to predict things that will match the experiment. So I think this is kind of a big challenge that we need to address, probably through more collaboration with experimentalists and kind of building more physical knowledge into the model itself, kind of what machine learning or symmetry preserving machine learning models are hoping to do. And then I'm also interested in, yeah, just learning more about these amorphous materials and trying to see if there are different scales of order in them. Because at least from talking with other scientists, it makes sense that there may be some scales of order because the material itself isn't completely random. That also wouldn't make sense. But in some materials, we're not totally sure how this order and or lack of order informs their properties. So kind of looking at that and how that informs our theoretical understanding of amorphous materials. And then I guess the last point is kind of more on my PhD research, but how to use machine learning to kind of reduce this design space of potential materials. I think that's a pretty big question that I'm hoping to work on, as well as mapping material structure to properties. So hoping to kind of synthesize my PhD work as well as what I'm doing this summer in the last point, I guess.
That's great. It sounds like there's a lot to look forward to. That's all the time we have for today, but I really enjoyed hearing about your work, and thank you so much for coming on here to talk with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
For those of you watching, remember that you can check out more episodes of Foundry Fireside on our website. Thank you.